Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the features, and I've given out a handout, so if you didn't get one of those handouts, please make sure that you get it. This is a lecture today about features, and we're waiting for our model to arrive. So let's get started talking about the individual features. Now I know that you talked about features in figure 1260. However, Rick Graham asked me to give a more detailed description about individual features. Now, first and foremost, I want to stress that when I talk about features and we're using them in our drawing process, I'm not doing a feature as far as a linear construct. I might develop the construction of the drawing with a line, but that's a very light construction line. So first and foremost, we're going to be doing this with a tonal application. That's why you're learning how to do an abstraction and then add to that, so that you're pulling out from that abstraction and putting value on top of it and developing structure. So, hi Adam. Make sure you get a handout, please. Okay. So on Tuesday, I'm going to be posting an actual demonstration that I did on Tuesday, and this is the second part of that demonstration. So if you want to review it and watch both, the first one is more dedicated to the skull and to the musculature. I'll briefly touch on that right now, but the other part is much more in-depth. So I'm going to direct the camera over to this area. And just talk briefly about some of the things that you're looking at. Okay, so on the skull itself, we have bony landmarks for the portrait. And as we know, this is the frontal bone. It is a three-part plane change. And with that three-part plane change, we also have a side plane. So we've got a front plane, side plane, back plane. Hence, we've got a three-dimensional form. Yeah, no problem. I'm not front.
Is this yours?
No, please. So we have what's called the superciliar arch. You're familiar with that term. I use it constantly. And on the skull, that's this measurement right across this line. It's commonly known as the brow ridge, and it's the decision, one of the first decisions that we make after the midline. It gives us our spatial orientation, our rotation and aspect, and that is a very important decision. Now here to the widow's peak, which is the hairline, and if someone doesn't have hair, then you use the top of the skull, or the decision where they have the last amount of hair, like on an older person. So that's the widow's peak right there, superciliar arch. And now we're going to get the orbital cavity. Now these are just review terms for you, but please take notes in your handout if you'd like. So what's important about the orbital cavity? Anyone? Okay, so the main importance of that orbital cavity, it's a housing for the structure of the eye. It starts right here. Here is the superciliar arch right here. And it has a trapezoid-like shape that is a downturned plane. And that's really crucial to understanding, because I will be mentioning that term a lot. What's in light, what's in shadow. And as far as the planar head, you can see this very well. So here is the planar concept, Here's the glabella right in this direction. And you can see even from these overhead lights that that's a downturned plane. So in other words, it faces away from the light. And it starts at the head of the root of the nose. So the orbital cavity has a 1-inch ball inside this cavity. And it's 1 inch from the time of birth until the time of death. It does not change in diameter. It's always 1 inch. And it sits in this cave-like structure. So rather than sitting at a vertical angle, the structure of the eye, man, I got a new marker, it's not coming in yet. The structure of the eye is the angle sits back. It sits more forward and it sits back. And then the alignment of that eye is that it's lower at the lacrimal duct and higher at the outer canthus. So if you saw a panoramic of this, this arc shows that it comes forward here and sits back in this direction. That's really important as far as placing the eye. Okay, so next, coming down this skull, we have the bone of the nose. This is the only portion of the skull that's actual bone. That's the nasal bone, and you can feel it on your own nose. I'll drop my glasses just a little bit. I was blessed that I always called it my ski jump, but I can feel very definitely the bottom of my nose where the bone is. One time I had some problems with my sinuses, and an ear, nose, and throat doctor was going to do surgery, and he said, "Do you want me to get rid of that bump?" And I said, "What bump?" And he goes, "Well, for $3,000 I could make that nice and straight and flush." Well, I realized that that was something that was unique to my family, particularly my dad's side of the family. And then we all had it. And so I grew up very familiar with that portion of the nose. So that is something that's unique to the model that you're drawing. Okay? So here's the structure. Here is a third from the top of the superciliar arch to the bottom of the anterior spine of the septum, from the anterior spine of the septum down to the mandible. Those measurements are 1/3. Okay? If there's a change in proportions, the most common proportion that changes is from the high point to here. That's your fixed point. Okay? The most common proportion is here in the forehead. And one of the reasons that varies is because of the models on the stand. And you can see the highs and lows of that model. And you can see times when that model is above eye level and below eye level, or at eye level. And so that can make a distinction be changing this variable. But what I often see in drawing is that the variable students switch is the length of the nose. Particularly certain models, I'll see an extension of the nose. And that's not the proportion that changes. The average length of a male and female nose is 2 eyes long, which an eye width is 1 inch. Okay, so in essence, the length of the nose is about 2 inches long. Now, if we were drawing in the ideal, that would be a perfect measurement. When you look at the drawings of Leonardo da Vinci, his models all look the same, don't they? they were doing inventions, and they had what was called a canon for ideal proportions. So some of these measurements that I'm giving you are ideal proportions of length. But then you apply that information to the model that you're drawing, okay? So then we get this next measurement, which is the anterior spine of the septum to the base of the mandible, or the bottom of the chin. This is all commonly known as the mouth box. The proportion that you need to know here is the midline of the mouth is often 2/3 the distance from here to here. The base of the lower portion of the colored portion of the lip is half. Okay? So it's half here to here, half here to here. All right? That's a good general rule of thumb. Now, how much is this new information to you? This is pretty new? Okay? All right, so then I'm going to just briefly touch over the musculature that applies to what I'm talking about today. For more in-depth information, look at the video that I'm going to post. So one of the muscles we're focusing on today has to do with the muscles of the nose. And the muscle of the nose that we're concentrating on is called the nasalis. And it has a side plane, a top plane, and then it has a strap that attaches to the anterior spine of the septum. One time I had a student ask me the question, what can cause a nostril to flare? And I thought, I don't know the answer to that. And that's how I generally learn things, is the student will ask a question, and so I look into it. And what happens is the nasalis has a strap that attaches here and here. So it surrounds the nostril, which is just basically cartilage, and it creates a lift. So remember, muscles do only one thing, they pull. Okay, so that strap pulls the nostril up and out, flaring it. Okay, the next muscle that we're going to talk about that applies today is the orbicularis oris. Now, the orbicularis oris is a free-floating muscle. It is on top of the maxilla. It conforms to the shape of the maxilla here. Okay, this line at the top of the gum line is called the alveolar process. So that's between bone and teeth. That's the line. And here's the maxilla, and here's the mandible. Now notice I broke the skull on Tuesday. This is the skull in its most basic form. This is the only more movable portion of that skull, is the mandible. The maxilla does not move. So the movement for the mouth takes place in the mandible. The mandible has two functions. It's a mover. So all of your expression as artists, we're concerned about that. So it comes in this mandible. It has that front plane right here that we see with these two key points. I'll often point these out because in students' drawings, these have to be very clear because that's where the perspective change takes place. Okay? And right here is the mentalis on that form. And you've got a muscle right there that is associated with it. It has kind of a filler or a cartilage, and then on top of that, you have, it's bifurcated. So sometimes in actors like Chris Pine, you'll get a cleft. Harrison Ford has a cleft right there. And so that is just created by that cleft. And by the way, okay, even though we're not talking about this specifically, if you didn't see my mask on, I've got a definite dimple. When I was born, I had two dimples. And there's different stories about dimples. And I studied with the master Nicky Covington, and he's here in Utah. And Nicky stated one reason that a dimple occurs, and does anybody have any family members that have dimples? Okay. My grandmother had a reason why I had a dimple. I got teased profusely when I was a little child about my dimples. And she said, when I left heaven, I got a kiss from God, and that caused me to have a dimple in my cheek, to always remember I was loved. Well, I really liked that explanation, and then when I studied with Nicky Covington, the accoucheur, he said it was a tear in the fascia. So that's not as glamorous, but what it does is it causes a fossa because of that rip in the fascia. So the fascia is just something like saran wrap that covers or coats the musculature. So when there's a rip or a tear there, you get a dimple. And that's true of the cleft of the chin. Okay, so now let's get down to brass tacks here. We've got the muscles here, We've got the orbicularis oris, and it's a free-floating muscle. And remember that it doesn't have any attachment to bone. But we have all this muscle that then connects down to 2 points, and they're both called nodes. As you age, that becomes more defined. On a young child, you don't see that definition. But here's what's happening. So you have the zygomatic minor, the zygomatic major. And the zygomatic major has a rotation of that is on the side plane. So it goes front and side. It wraps around the zygomatic. Now, one of the things that in anatomy that you should ask yourself is, how thick is that muscle? And it's surprising how not thick the muscles of the skull are. Okay, so if you can envision the thickness of a rubber band, that's your zygomatic major and minor. Thin, right? And so those are very thin. We've got the nasalis very thin. This frontalis muscle is bifurcated, and it only pulls up. So it is like if you took a slice of bread and spread butter over it, that's how thin it is. We've got this muscle of the mouth, the orbicularis oris, and it's bifurcated. Bifurcation means that it's in 2 parts. So that just means that it's split. So it originates, comes to here and inserts, and then wraps around here, has a point of attachment, and then comes up to here and inserts. So it surrounds the opening of the mouth with the top of the maxilla, the base of the maxilla, and the top of the mandible being the opening of the mouth. Now, in the sketchbooks of Leonardo da Vinci, he talks about this midline, and he talks about the fact that that midline can do this, it can do this, and it can do this, depending on the eye level. So back to this node, we have on the side of this, we have this connecting into the node is a group of muscles called the quadrates. And there's specific muscles inside that I'll talk about at another time, but they're the depressor muscles. It takes 37 muscles to smile. It doesn't take that many to actually frown. So it's a depressor, meaning that that muscle grabs the corner of the mouth and pulls down. Now, you have a group of muscles that are deep, deep muscles. And we don't normally study those deep muscles, but they can affect any kind of expression. One of them is the risorius muscle, and it pulls lateral. So you have muscles that pull straight up. The zygomatic major and minor pulls straight up. The risorius muscle pulls to the side or lateral. There's a deep layer muscle called the buccinator. And the buccinator is when you, so much easier when you can demonstrate with your face, but when you blow like a fish and you extend your cheek out, or you can envision blowing in a trumpet, that is your buccinator muscle. The common name of that is your cheek. So that's a very easy, understandable muscle. And then you get these two muscles on the mentalis. They have filler, like a half dome of cartilage. Okay, so that's our muscles. Briefly. I'm going to bring this back here. Make sure you can see this. Okay, so now, one of the most important things that I think to kind of mention is that there was an illustrator in about the early 40s, 50s by the name of Bern Hogarth. And he has a series of drawing books that are excellent. And he has one in particular called Drawing the Human Head, or a variant of that title. But Bern Hogarth, and that's his name right there, he was just a master at understanding structure. So if you want to practice structure, get Bern Hogarth, because that helps you to see a really three-dimensional form. Now, as I mentioned, first you want to sight your overall alignment on your superciliar arch. And right here you have a sinus cavity, the sinus eminence. And as you saw over here on the musculature, you have this little tail right here coming off this. Here's the orbicularis oculi surrounding this cavity with the levator of the eyelid. And it has just this little tail coming out. That's called the procerus. And it comes off the orbicularis oculi. If you hear oculi, it means eye. If you hear oris, it means mouth. So on top of that, you have this little muscle, and it's not that big, really. It sits on top of the procerus, and I think comic book artists have used this a lot to capture expression, but that's called the corrugator muscle. So you have two layers of muscle right there. And what does the muscle do? It pulls. So what does it do? It pulls up and out. So it is responsible for the expressions in the brow ridge. Okay? It's helpful to know, right? So we have this form of the glabella. Now that glabella is a downturned plane. It faces away from the light. It is not a structure that is unique to that model. I mean, it is unique to that model, and it turns down and under. So this plane does this. It's downturned. Okay, and it's the beginning of the nose root. So you'll always see an intersection right here. And the important part about that landmark, when the eye is at rest, in other words, when you're looking straight out at eye level, you'll often see a correlation between this and where the opening of the eye is. So this lid is usually lining up right here, this upper lid. Now, we'll get to the eye on another day. But first and foremost, you're going to sight the trajectory of the whole angle of that nose, right? Keeping in mind that it is 2 eyes wide in length. In other words, 2 inches. Then you're going to sight this overall proportion of the length of the nose by describing where the anterior spine of the septum sits. Then the back of the nose here describes an important proportional distance. What does it describe? Anyone?
Is it the distance between the eyes?
Yeah. It is an eye width. So between here, there's one eye width. So that one eye width between the eyes is the distance from the end of the nose to the nostril. And then you use that common decision called a plumb line to go from the back of the nostril to the lacrimal duct. And I started to say that, but I think I got off topic. But one of the reasons that we use the nostril is that it plumbs this lacrimal duct. And the importance of the lacrimal duct is that it is the anatomical center. Okay, so that lacrimal duct has great importance right here. That's halfway between, that lacrimal duct sits here, and it's half here to here and half here to here. I did this drawing that I wanted to just show you briefly. This is a demo I did in class of a model that we had here at Salt Lake Community College. She was just a really fun model. Her name's Blythe. Oops, there goes my gap. And this is about what I want you to see as far as how much information you want to give in that early blocking stage. Now this is something I'm going to work with you on post. Some of your drawings are too basic at this stage. I'm just seeing the early blocking and nothing else. And so I'm going to post drawings of what I expect. So please just follow those examples of how much information at the stage that we're at you need to start developing the blocking and going into contour. That doesn't mean that you're not going to add all the basics like the construction lines for light logic and getting into light logic, but the figures are a little too basic in your assignment. So that's something to address. Okay, so this is the composition of the nose. So right here in the nose, we have something called an alar. And an alar is just a fancy term for a sphere-like form. This is the alar. And on many models, you'll see a break right about here, a plane break. And then you'll see a plane break right here before it goes into that sphere-like form of the alar. On many people, it's bifurcated, meaning that there's a line down this because the straps of the nasalis hold this down like this, okay? So as you're describing this in value, you will often see, because this is a sphere, you'll see a form shadow edge and you'll see highlight on the edge of that nose. The opening called a nostril right here. This is something that Anthony Ryder taught me, and I've never forgotten it. He said, in his experience, most artists are not drawing the nostril wide enough, and they tend to really scrimp on that. And I thought this was kind of vulgar, if you will, to talk about, but he said that remember that the opening of the nose or the nostril is a finger width. I haven't ever forgotten it, so I guess it worked. So that's a finger width. Now in a photograph will take that image and turn that black or dark, because photographs do that. And this area of the nose is very vascular, meaning it has a lot of blood flow. As far as painting, we get our yellows up in this skull on the frontalis because it's closer to bone. In this area of the face, it's much more fleshy, or in other words, vascular. And so you have more blood flow in this section of your face. And so because of that, this nostril can get very red and vascular. A photograph can't tell or differentiate between that in that same way. And so shadow will become black on a photograph, where it just means that there's a lot of blood flow in this area and it becomes very vascular. Now the nostril itself, it has a little wing to it. So here's the alar, and it has a light facing plane. Okay, so this plane right here is a light facing plane. Okay? As it wraps down around and comes into the opening of the nasal aperture, this is a downturn plane, although it is vascular as well. When I sculpted in the Écorché, when I sculpted this, I sculpted it's huge. It's probably 26 inches. I used 5 blocks of plasticine to create it. And I sculpted that with Dan Thompson in Philadelphia. And it was a lot of fun. But when we were sculpting the nose, he just had us draw a wedge. So we just drew this very sculpted this very three-dimensional box-like form like this, and just stuck it on the front plane of the nose. That was the nose. And that was really interesting to me. So the wings of the nose, or the cartilage, or the nostrils, are separate entities. But the main function of that, it's a three-dimensional form, and it blocks light. So as far as lighting the model, the light logic, you'll usually see some kind of cast shadow sitting underneath the anterior spine of the septum. Now, that very familiar bony landmark is sitting right there. It divides on the midline. And here we have, there's the anterior spine of the septum, okay? Its division is this cartilage right here. And that's called the septum. So here's the anterior spine of the septum, and its division is in the center point here. Now, to this point, medical doctors have not been able to recreate cartilage. And maybe they will at some point in the future, but to my knowledge, they haven't been able to reconstruct cartilage. And so that cartilage is what you have. And that important anatomical landmark right here of the anterior spine of the septum helps us to develop the proportions of length within the nose. Okay, so next, and these are drawings right here that I put up for you that were done by Russian artists. And they were just, oh man, they really understood form. And you can see this is so important to see in your drawing. So here's the glabella. This is a light facing plane. You'll often see highlight right here. You'll see the nostril. You'll see this whole cartilage right here and the opening of the nostril. So the wing of the nose is right here. So you'll see a form shadow edge along here with this turning down and under and then creating a cast shadow. Now, one of the aspects about a cast shadow is that cast shadow takes the form of what it sits on, right? So it's taking the form of the maxilla. So a form shadow edge, does it do that? No, a form shadow edge does not conform to what it's sitting on, but a cast shadow does. So let's see if I can recreate this for you with some paper towel. Okay, so here we have the shape of the mouth. This may not work real well, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, so this is catching the light. So underneath here is a trough-like form, called the philtrum. And I can't get it up high enough. Okay, and it's a 3-part plane change coming across this. So what we're wanting to see is we're wanting to see that 3-part plane change. There's the front plane, and then you have the 2 side planes of the maxilla. Okay, so as you drape that cast shadow across, you're both seeing longitude and latitude. So longitude is the vertical direction, latitude is the horizontal direction. And that cast shadow will strike across that maxilla at a 45-degree angle. The reason for that is that light strikes form at a 45-degree angle, okay? It's always, always consistent. I mean, there's instances where you could actually bounce light up from the ground. I remember one time a student turned in a drawing and she had laid on the ground and bounced the light up in a very unnatural way that light didn't work, to show that you could recreate light doing something different. Okay, there's always exceptions to the rule. However, in most cases, drawings are lit from behind, slightly behind, and at a 45-degree angle. That's our model stand is lit that way. And so that's a constant in drawing. Light strikes the form at a 45-degree angle. You can see that line being described by the direction of the line in the Leonardo da Vinci drawings, the Michelangelo drawings. You can see their handedness. In other words, Michelangelo was right-handed, Leonardo da Vinci was left-handed until he turned 68, I believe, and he had a stroke, and then his direction of his line changed because he began to use his right hand. I just recently became aware of a book that, if you're interested, it has nothing to do with class, but it is an interesting read. It's called Leonardo by Wallace Isaacson, and it tells a lot about the life of Leonardo da Vinci. I think it's fascinating. To me, that always adds more to what I want to learn. Okay, so that's basically your nose. Let's see if I've covered it all. I believe so. So first and foremost, we start here. That's essential to see this. We move on to this, where we flesh out more of the form, the back of the hair, and I always take this measurement from here to here on the hairline. Okay, so next I'm going to talk to you about the mouth. Knowing the anatomy that we talked about, let's slide over here. And okay, trade to a red marker. All right, now this is the philtrum. As you sight this, this is a trough. As a trough, it's going to have a light side and a shadow side. So here's our shadow side. Oftentimes, not always, but often and especially dependent upon skin type, you'll have a highlight right here and a highlight right here. Because of that concept I showed you with the paper, it is conforming to the shape of the maxilla. There's oftentimes a white line on either side of the upper colored portion of the lip. It is not highlight, although there can be a highlight there. It is called the linea alba. And when you see a milk mustache, that's where it's lining up, is right on that linea alba. In Greek, that word linea alba just means white line. So here's the philtrum. Now back to this form right here, the orbicularis oris. Remember, it's bifurcated, so it has 2 sections to that muscle. So it's split in half. As that comes around, first and foremost, we have this sphere. Okay, so right here we have a sphere. And that sphere is another form of cartilage called the alar. So because it's a sphere, it has unique properties to help you to decide the light logic. So it will always have, depending on the direction of the light source, it will have a highlight right here because it's a sphere. Sometimes on a nursing infant, you'll get a little callus on that. And then it has, to the side of this, it has two forms. And one of these forms is called a tubercle. Well, they're both called tubercles. There's a tubercle here and a tubercle here. Okay? And what's important about this tubercle is the cross contour line. So this is how to draw a compelling mouth. So you're going to orient to the top of the upper lip. And you're going to see this as a two-part plane change within the tubercle. Okay, so as you drop a cross contour line down, this comes out, around, and back in. Okay, out, around, and back. Out, around, and back. Ending in at the base of this node, right here, you will have what's commonly known as a cast shadow. That's usually where you get a little indentation, because the midline of the mouth, as we look at this, and I cited back there the different directions, it looks like a little Cupid's bow. Okay, so here's the Cupid's bow. So here it comes right here around, and I've drawn it right here for you. Okay, so it comes up into that cast shadow and then down to the node. Again, here's the cast shadow, comes out, around, and down to the node. And the node itself becomes a little trowel-like form. Okay? That's the tubercle, ending in the node. Okay? So this is the tubercle and this is the node. That's the upper lip. Now, let me go back to the skull. Go back to the, here we have our plane. So here to here, that's a downturned plane, right? You can see with the light in the room, which I don't have this lit well, but you can see that that upper lip is a downturned plane, right? You can see the upper lip is an upturned plane, a light-facing plane. And notice that the width between here to the nodes is wider. Okay? And I want you to understand why. Because this dental arch on the maxilla is wider. So the expanse of the upper lip is wider across that form. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm actually talking longer because, first off, our model hasn't shown. And I can give you more depth of information because of that. So that's really fun. All right, now, the lower lip. It is also coming across that dental arch. It is bifurcated. On some people, you really see that really well. And it has two tubercles. So tubercle 1, tubercle 2. And they are not the length of the upper lip. This is the reason why. So back up to the musculature, and I'm going to just rotate the camera so we can come back here. Okay, so down here, we have this mentalis group of muscles, right? Okay, now I'm going to show you what that looks like. So this is a column. It could also be called a cylinder. And here's the head of this cylinder. So it does this, and it does this, and it does this. So the structure of the form of this is that as we wrap across contour line here, that's what this is doing here. Okay, it ends at the bottom of this and depends upon the model that you're drawing. So this is a landmark. It's evident on everyone I've ever observed. And one of the things I like to do when I'm watching TV with my husband is I'm looking more about maybe less about the storyline and more about observing the characters. So we have what's called this division line, and it's called the mental sulcus. Really, really important landmark. Okay? So this is a downturn plane. It's facing away from the light. And then as we begin this, then we're going to get into what's called, here is the base of the colored portion of the lip. Here is the base of the mental sulcus. It is a downturn plane. Then we're going to get into what's commonly called the chin box. But the mouth is from the base of the chin to the top of the anterior spine of the septum as we draw it. Okay? Review our proportions. Midline of the mouth, 2/3. This to this. Bottom of the colored portion of the lip, half here to here, half here to here. Okay, so this chin box is really important. As I mentioned, it's surrounded by the mentalis. If we were to see this, it's bifurcated, meaning that it's in two parts, with commonly, especially on a male figure, you'll see a cleft here. Females do not have that cleft, most generally, because on a female, even the most underweight, undernourished female, there is a layer of adipose tissue or fat cells. And it just creates a more full form. There's the mandible. And I was also going to say something about this. So let me finish that and then I'll go back up. So here's a light-facing plane and a downturn plane with commonly, because of the mentalis, you might see a cleft in here. No? Okay. So then we have the three-part plane change that happens in the mandible. All right, now, the plane change back on this lower lip is less than this to this, is less than this because it covers less area. Now I mentioned I was going to go back up to the philtrum. One time I was asking a dentist, I was sculpting this area for this class, this workshop that I was taking with Dan Thompson, and I asked, why on an elderly person can you often see the skull? So if the muscle is still there, the orbicularis oris, why is it that on elderly, both male and female, you can often see the skull? I remember walking into a beauty supply store, and there was a woman that she looked in her hundreds, and her skin was so transparent, you could see the skull underneath. It was very interesting. I wanted to stare, but that's not polite. But he said that the reason is, as you age, you lose collagen. And so everyone has the orbicularis oris, but the filler that makes that more full and voluptuous is, the filler of the mouth, is the collagen. Now, the lip portion of the mouth is vascular, meaning it has a lot of blood flow. And one thing that blood flow has, that as you age, you lose blood flow to the lips. And I used to only say female figures, but now I'm going to add male, female. I've seen lipstick on male, female. And one of the reasons that makeup artists apply lipstick is they're enhancing that vascularity within the lips, creating more of a strong allure. And so that's the whole reason to increase that, is you're showing that there's more blood flow to that area. Okay, I thought that was kind of interesting, that whole concept of why the lip is. So this is wider, this is less. And on a lip, it's better to imply information than to apply. Okay, so you get your basic construction lines. And what I mean by that is, in the 80s, my sister-in-law, there was a makeup technique that they took a really dark color or a value of lipstick, and they put an outline around their lip, kind of like the Joker, like big old outline, like a clown would do. And then they'd apply lipstick, right? Giving more definition to the lips. Well, as the lipstick went away, because it would go away first, but the lip liner would stay. And so all you'd see is like this very comical outline of the lip. It was really an interesting look. So we don't want to do that on our drawings. Okay, we want to pay attention to the light logic. This is coming up towards light. This turns down and under. This has cast shadow here. This turns back to the arch of the trowel-like form of the node. This is a light-facing plane. Although, and this is the catch. Wait for it, right? So underneath this lip is a cast shadow. And if you can imagine, that lip is sitting at a 30-degree angle. In just a moment, I'm going to show you that, but keep that in your mind. So this has cast shadow. But when it pulls away from cast shadow, and that cast shadow is conforming to the midline of the lip. This is a light-facing plane. You will often see highlight here. And then it's turning down and under to that border between the colored portion of the lip and down to the mental focus. One thing that I used to think when I first started in college was I would be known as a greater artist if I could just detail every single aspect of that lip. And so these big, heavy creases, I love drawing older people. Back when I was training, we draw from National Geographic magazines. And I apologize. Now, I guess artists have been sued, and students as well, from drawing from National Geographic magazines. Rightfully so, they own the copyright. But then we did. And I drew as many nationalities and different ages as I could get my hands on. And I just hyper-realistically detailed all aspects of that. Now, I know, when I know better, I did better, right? According to Maya Angelou. Well, what I learned was that distorted your perspective. So when you do that on the mouth, the viewer's eye is directed to the mouth. Where if your goal is to see just mouth, that's perfect. But most often we want to first direct the viewer's eye into the eye and then the secondary aspects of the rest of the portrait. One time I was training with Nelson Shanks, and a woman in the class asked him, this woman said, Nelson, when you see wrinkles on a woman, do you accentuate them? And he just stood there for just a little bit. And in Nelson Shanks' way, he said, first off, I only paint billionaires. He actually said that. And I went, that's fantastic. But he did. He only painted billionaires. He painted Princess Di. He painted Pavarotti. He did lots of very famous people. And a lot of really wealthy women that were older. And that was a really good question. So if you see wrinkles in the lips or on the upper part of the maxilla, do you go in and accentuate those? What would your answer be?
Depends on what you're trying to display. Like if you want them to look older, then yeah, but if you don't.
Okay, if this is a commission, what would you do?
Probably not. You want them to look good.
Okay, probably not, right? So you are the artist. You're not copying a photograph. You are painting, even though you can use photographic reference. You're trying to give the image of the soul of the person. And if an overemphasis of wrinkles causes the viewer to only see that, then the whole form, and you want to cut back on that. So we can, as artists, manipulate that. We can direct how the viewer sees the portrait. Okay, so then right here. I ran out of room. Try it right here. Then I'll give you a break. Okay. Now, this is the three-part tubercles that I showed you in this earlier demonstration. I want to direct your attention to the lip in profile, because this is an important concept. Let me turn to this. Okay, so here we have, here's the anterior spine of the septum. Here's the base of the mandible. Here's the 2/3 point of the lower lip, the measurement of the lip, of the midline. Okay? Now, the lower lip is recessed in relationship to the upper lip. And the degree of this is at a 30-degree angle. Okay, so this relationship sits back. If you were to make this a vertical, it would be very unusual. Okay, so this overall arching form in profile, that means a side view, is back at a 30-degree angle. And let me work you through the plane changes. So here's the philtrum that I talked about right here, this trough. And it has a two-part plane change. So coming down this form, there's a plane change right here. Downturn plane. Plane change, light-facing plane. Upper lip, we have the top of the colored portion of the lip. In profile, you have a rotation where this is a light-facing plane. And this turns down and wraps back to that cast shadow. Next, you have the lower lip. And the lower lip, unless somebody has an overbite. Okay, just really quickly. That's when the jaw is thrust forward like this. Like that. That's an overbite. So this is an upturned plane, except for where it's pulling into cast shadow, right here. Then it wraps down and under. And this is a 2-part plane change here. So it's wrapping down and under, down and under. And then it pulls out, hits that highlight, and down and under. And then all this to the mental sulcus is a downturned plane. Okay? Then you have the chin box in profile. You have a light facing plane here. And then it wraps down and under. I taught a lot of workshops at the Kimball Arts Center in Park City, Utah. One time I trained an artist who was once a lawyer, and I really don't want you to take pictures.
I can take pictures of this. Okay.
It will be posted. A lawyer in Park City, and she was in Russia and she got her law degree, and when she came to the United States, they wouldn't allow her to practice here. So she decided, well, what I'll do is I will just decide to change my whole field, and she started to become an artist. Well, in this particular workshop, we were just doing portraiture, and she said, Sandy, no matter what I do, everything I draw, male, female, looks like a man. What am I doing wrong? How would you answer her? Any thoughts?
Is it something to do with the lips where like she wasn't filling them in enough?
No, not necessarily. That's a good thought, though. Anyone?
Is her chin too strong?
That was one of the aspects, is that everything was so hard an angle and so over exaggerated. And it's easier to do that. That's the whole basis for caricatures, right? But, our dear faculty, Rick Graham, that's how he earned his living when he first started as an artist, is he set up a little booth in Trolley Square, and he just drew caricatures. He got really good at portraits doing that. So one of the things that I caution you about is an overemphasis of the feature. So what I mean by that is not that you don't see the plane changes, but you don't exaggerate it, okay? And that's what I'm talking about. So she was repeatedly exaggerating and overemphasizing traits that make male female. One time we had an assignment up at the U, and when I was retraining with Paul Davis, I think that was John Erickson, sorry. He had us take a photograph of a famous person and go and get a photograph of that person at a copy center and do 2 images of both and 1 in reverse, and then cut it in half. And we were to match left to left and right to right. You cannot believe the differences. In the Asian culture, they believe that we have a male and female side of our face. Interesting concept, isn't it? And so we get a mother side and a father side of our face. Now, I don't know if that's a correct concept or not, but it's an interesting aha moment. But matching those very famous people, I did Winston Churchill. And you cannot believe the distortion between those 2 rights and 2 lefts. It was remarkable. And so we are structured. I'm going to just write this down. You'll hear me say this again in class. we have structured symmetry. Okay? That means that we have two eyes. We have two sides to the nose. We have two sides to the mouth. We have two sides to our face, right? But within that alignment, although we're structured symmetrically, that's perfect when we're drawing from invention to know that. You want to align your perspective. You want to get all these aspects drawing correctly. But then, when you're actually drawing from life, you have to then get your proportions of length for that model to get likeness. So, why do I stress this? All of this is incredibly important. And again, this lecture will be posted on Canvas, so you can view it again if you'd like to. If you want more information on this, please don't hesitate to ask me a question, how it applies to your drawing. And the aspects of using this with value will be a whole separate lecture. How we apply this information now to our drawings. And we'll be doing that with value rather than a linear construct. But each of these, if we're doing an invention then, or a memory drawing, that's a very different concept than drawing from life. So drawing from life, we know that it's structured symmetry. But then we apply it to the model that we're working on. And the muscles that I was talking about. So here's the part of asymmetry. So on a muscle, I was studying at crochet with Nikki, and the muscles itself, I was asking my brother, who's a doctor, he was talking about the bandwidths of the different muscles and how thick the masseter muscle is, which is this muscle back here that's the big mover of your mouth. It's about 2 centimeters thick, and it's this cord that when you're very upset, that bundles, and you're grinding your jaw, right? When you're seething, that you really, or chewing, you see that muscle. If you're seeing someone going after a steak at a restaurant, you're gonna watch this muscle. That sounded gross. Sorry to all you vegetarians. Okay, so how does this apply on this asymmetry? One time and this is my final story, I promise. Not ever, but right now. I feel like I'm landing a plane with my black gloves here. I one time was studying with Dan Thompson in Philadelphia, and he encouraged me to go to this museum called the Mutter Museum. And it's fascinating. Part of it wasn't so much because it detailed a lot of diseases. That was kind of gross. But he said, well, go into this room where they have this big display of skulls. So I did, and they had felons, and they had underneath what they had done. And he said what they had done had matched the shape of their skull. I didn't buy into that very well. But they had a big wall of skulls from one particular village. How they got that is, I don't know. But they had labels underneath the skull of whatever occupation they did in life. Like they had bakers, and they had those that were farriers, and those that were, in a village, whatever they did. And underneath one skull in particular, it was labeled Village Idiot. Now, how would you like to be that skull on a wall, right? It was pretty sad. But I think the overarching thought on that is that what we do in life can have an impact of how our face develops. And we have, in our face, we have redundancy. Now, I have a son-in-law that is just beloved to me. I love him dearly. And he grew up in France, and his face sculpture, when he smiles from one side of his mouth. And I did research on it, and it's subtle. And that's the thing about the mouth, is these are beautiful little subtleties. So I thought, because we're symmetrical, that we would pull from both directions. And according to my brother, who's a doctor, he said that the body has redundancy, first off, that if one muscle doesn't work as well as something else, the body compensates and uses whatever is on the other side to get that task done. Well, but from birth on, did you know that you smile the same way you do for your entire life? From birth to death, you smile the same way. Your smile doesn't change. And part of that has to do with the musculature that you were born with and how that develops. The artist that I mentioned several times, Daniel Green, he did his art instruction back east, I think the Rhode Island School of Design, but he said that they were on a several floored building, and on one floor they had this big common area between musicians and artists. And he said he studied the artists, and you could see the structure of the face based upon what kind of instrument they played. So those that played a trumpet, that buccinator muscle, that risorius muscle, really made a difference. Now let's think about some actresses. Okay? Who can you think of that smiles really laterally? Anyone come to mind?
Cameron Diaz?
Yeah, right. Okay, so her muscles don't pull up. They pull this way. How about Julia Roberts? Big time this way, right? Her features are so disproportionate when you really look at her face, but they all add up to be beautiful. Let's see, Jennifer Garner, another one. Chris Pine, as I said, he uses both. I can't think about Zachary Quinto. I can't think of what he does. But there was one by the name of Christine Baranski, and she pulls up like this. So study family members and friends, how they smile. And that, first off, they'll wonder what's on their face, why you're staring at them. But it really is due to the underlying structure of the form. Now, I'm going to stop the camera here. Thank you. If there's any questions, please.